Well, good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. A number of you have requested to have copies of the program. Admiral Daly and I are providing USB devices in the lobby, so please help yourself. We just asked you, don't plug them in at home, take them to work and plug them in. Except at the Naval Academy, thank you. This afternoon's panel is Forging Links for Cyber Operations, Command, Control, and Policy. Our moderator this afternoon is my very good friend, Larry Caviola.
Hey, thanks very much, Doc. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Before we begin, let me, on behalf of the panel, add our thanks to Admiral Mike Miller, Superintendent here of the Naval Academy, and to retired Admiral Pete Daly, CEO of the Naval Institute, for hosting and for organizing this very fine conference today. And also let me add our thanks to the William M. Wood Foundation for their very kind sponsorship of the conference today. Before we begin, let me introduce very briefly the panel here, because I think we have a very distinguished group here that's going to be able to address the topic first and then certainly take your questions thereafter. So let me begin on my immediate right here. First is Rear Admiral Diane Weber, United States Navy, who's Deputy Commander of the Navy's Fleet Cyber Command and Deputy Commander of the 10th Fleet. These organizations, as most of you know, are at the cutting edge of the Navy's cyber efforts. Admiral Weber has had a number of important assignments involving command, control, and networks. Next is Mr. Jim Lewis, or James Lewis, who's Director and Senior Fellow of the Technology and Public Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And Jim is a very prolific thinker, writer, and speaker on many issues, strategy issues and other issues, but in particular on cyber-related issues. Next, Rear Admiral Elizabeth Train, United States Navy, who's the Director of Intelligence, the J2, on the Joint Staff. She brings to the panel her deep background both in naval intelligence and in the joint world, most recently, before this assignment, as Director of Intelligence for the United States Pacific Command. And completing the panel is Major General Jennifer Napper, United States Army, who's the Director of Strategic Plans and Policy, that is the J5, for the United States Cyber Command. General Napper has had extensive experience in command, troop, and staff officer positions, many of those involving network operations. I was struck earlier today at this morning's panel. It seemed to be evocative of, I guess this topic seemed to be evocative of people relating stories about when they first encountered networks or the internet or something like that. And so it got me thinking about the first time I encountered something that was then called the ARPANET, which would have been back in 1979. And I was a fresh-caught lieutenant commander. I was teaching out at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and somebody said, hey, you want to come look at something that's really interesting? And I said, yeah, why not? And so they asked me to come into a room there that was in the basement of one of the buildings. And there in the middle of the room was a teletype terminal, kind of your standard old teletype terminal with a roll of paper in it and keys and so on. And they said, this is something called the ARPANET. And I said, what's an ARPANET? And they said, well, it's a network. And I didn't know what a network was. I had just come off a destroyer, actually a World War II era destroyer. We didn't have networks on there. I thought networks were something that television companies had. But the professor there gave me a demonstration of how this worked. And he sent some email, I guess what it would be the precursor of email, and he went out and queried some databases. One of them was in Boston, and one of them was in California, and someplace else in California, and so on. And he said, this is the future. This is where things are going. And I said, wow, that's really neat. And then I went back to my office and had my dumb terminal, dialed up something, and stuck the phone in the back of this dumb terminal to do some communication with the computer system at the school. So we've come a long way, clearly, and it's certainly a lot of fun to work on these subjects and to think about them. As Captain Simon said, the subject for this afternoon is forging the links for cyber operations, command, control, and policy. Now, this morning we heard a lot about the interface between public and private, which is extremely important. I think this afternoon what you're going to hear is a lot more that's specific to the military and the way the military is dealing not only with its usage of the web or web-like capabilities, which we call cyberspace, but also their dependency on cyberspace, the increasing dependency. Also coming to grips with an understanding of what cyber can do in terms of fully integrated joint military operations. Last week, as was mentioned earlier, Secretary Panetta spoke about emerging threats and opportunities and how our defense establishment is responding to these. As was very widely reported, he took care to talk about things that the Department of Defense was working on to align technology and policy, the alignment of technology and policy. And this is a very important subject, and I think we'll hear some more about that this afternoon. One way to think about that, at least that I've worked on, is to think about it in terms of the development of a system of governance for the application of cyber power. Now, what does governance mean? Some people have different definitions of governance. I actually went and looked this up. There is an Institute for Governance out there. I found them through Google. And they have a definition for what governance is. And they say that governance determines who has power, who makes decisions, how other players make their voice heard, and how account is rendered. So in short, if you think about that, what they're saying is that governance is about power, it's about decision making, and it's about accountability. And those are all things that we who are in the military or of the military or associated with the military live by every day. The exercise of power, decision making, and accountability. So we need to develop and continue to develop this system of governance for the application of cyber power. As we think about this a little bit more, we can come to the conclusion, or at least I've come to the conclusion, that where we are in the development of this system of governance is really another example of how the push of technology typically outpaces our ability to develop the governance necessary to fully or to develop the full impact of that technology. Technology outpacing governance. So when we think about this, it's instructive to look to history. This is a history conference. It's instructive to look at history. We heard about some history this morning, which was very, very helpful. In a sense, this is really more than just offense versus defense. Okay, we've always had this sort of classic offense versus defense sort of thing. But when we talk about governance, we're really talking about something more than that. For those of us in the Navy or who've been around the Navy, is a high-tech service. It likes technology. It likes to deal with technology in a variety of ways. But just think about it in a variety of domains, be it propulsion, when going from sail to steam to nuclear, in weaponry, going from short-range small-bore cannon to long-range fires to missiles, these sorts of things, and then advances in communications and intelligence, surveillance technologies. In each of those cases, if you study the history of them, what you'll find is that there's typically a gap between the introduction of the technology and the development of the governance, if you will, that is the ability to take full advantage of those technologies. Governance can mean the full set of laws, regulations, policies, rules of engagement, organizations, ethics, all of these sorts of things, just to name a few, you can wrap up inside this envelope called governance. So that's really what we're talking about here. If you look here to the 20th century, a couple of interesting examples of this as well. One is the introduction of air power in the 1930s, and use of air power. We had aircraft. We knew how to do certain things. We were developing more sophisticated ways of bombing and so on. But that technology was leading the strategy. It was leading the governance. It was leading the ability to think about how do we really employ these things. It wasn't until World War II, where we had the pressure of the war, where we really began to try to catch up between the governance, if you will, and the technology. In the nuclear field, of course, nuclear weapons, introduced in the late 1940s, but it took us decades to develop the governance for as we thought about how to use nuclear weapons and how to deter their use. So I mentioned Secretary Panetta earlier. General Alexander, has spoken out on these issues very eloquently. He's not shy about talking about what's necessary here. He talks about the need to transform the way our government works in the cyber realm. He's talked specifically about the need to reform command and control relationships, noted that it's a team effort, not only across the DoD, but across the government, and the need to obtain the authorities, the policies, and the rules of engagement to make it all work together. Came across an interesting quote when I was thinking about this conference from a Professor Patrick Lynn at Cal Poly. He was talking about robotics, but I thought it was a quote that was applicable here. And that is, he said, technology is fast, but ethics and law are slow. And so an important question for us today, or for the country in general, is can we do better when it comes to the application of cyber power? Because it's going to be absolutely necessary, in my view, to do that. So with that, let's turn to the distinguished panel members here for their thoughts on maybe that subject, but whatever subjects they'd like to speak on. And I'd like to begin with Admiral Weber. You're up.
Thanks, Larry. First, let me thank the Naval Institute and Vice Admiral Daly for giving me the opportunity to be here. I used to tell everybody it was always great to break out of the Pentagon for a day, but I'm not in the Pentagon anymore. I'm over at the fort, which is a pretty good deal. But I did put aside the command tickler for a little bit, and that's still a good deal. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. As Larry pointed out, I'm the Deputy Commander at 10th Fleet and Fleet Cyber, and we basically direct cyber operations in support of Navy and Joint Forces. And that covers quite a bit of territory. And I'm only going to neck down on a couple of things that Vice Admiral Rogers has focused on during his tenure here. And I'll just preface my comments by saying there's room for improvement on all fronts. And we're looking at a lot of things and working improvement in a lot of areas. But just a couple of things I think are worth mentioning here. In the environment we consider ourselves to be working in, I think at this point in the afternoon in the conference, it should be intuitively obvious that power projection of a ship, a submarine, an airplane, or any strike force is limited if you take away that the eyes, the ears, the voice of those units. Adding complexity to those challenges of keeping C2 and the eyes and the ears and the voice online for the warfighting platforms is the fact that we think we'll be working in a contested environment. In other words, we have lots of bandwidth today in a contested environment, maybe not so much, and how do you manage that? Also adding complexity is the fact that while we tend to think of, well, we're very territorial and possessive, it's ours, it's DOD's, internet network capability, we are inextricably linked to the commercial sector. The satellites that we lease are quite frequently commercial. The landlines that we get from DISA, while they have a DISA label, there are commercial leases behind them. Public entities, commercial entities write software, build the gear we use. So if that sector is not healthy and doing well and well protected, then DoD is at risk. So you will see, most likely, or hear Major General Napper take on some of their relationships and partnerships with DHS and the commercial sector and things that they have set as a priority to help mitigate some of those vulnerabilities. But that's the environment. And in that environment, Larry, you're absolutely right. Vice Admiral Rogers has set a priority on accountability, and he likens it to the accountability in the nuclear community, where you know exactly what you have, what standard you've built the network to, and you go out and you rigorously inspect and hold the team accountable for meeting those standards. So with that, he's launched a very aggressive inspection program. The results aren't pretty. They do lay bare quite a few vulnerabilities, but armed with that information, we're able to address manning needs, training, equipment, vulnerabilities, things that we need to do in the acquisition pipeline to close off vulnerabilities. And so I think it's the right way to go. If governance is about making decisions about what goes on the network, what the architecture will be, again, those inspections reveal a lot about how we got where we are today and how we probably need to take some steps so that we don't wind up there in the future. So we're all about accountability. It's one of the boss's #1 priorities. He has several #1 priorities. And couldn't agree more with accountability as tops on anybody's list if they're working in networks today. Of course, he also recognizes that if you want to be accountable, you got to understand how you intend to operate. So he's very close to signing out his dynamic integrated operations concept, which is to bring, Larry, you talked about defense versus offense, and I would argue that it's one line, one continuum. And too often we put operations for networks in those two bins, and it doesn't make sense. I will tell you, my experience at NORAD Northcom, we treated degradation of the network as a standard, Sixer type problem. We began to bump crypto, reseat patches, that sort of thing. 2 weeks after the exercise, when the IA shop and the Cyber Fusion cell completed their analysis, we realized it was something much different without going into any details. So having that end-to-end look and having the IA folks, the offensive folks end-to-end with the defensive look on your network simultaneously is definitely the way you have to go. So the boss is driving the two sides of the house. He owns both pieces, and he's driving those organizations together for an end-to-end look at the networks. And I think we're seeing a lot of good things come out of that. And I think I'll stop there. I think most of the other things we're doing will come out in some of the questions. But it's an exciting journey. Every day something new and different, and never a dull moment. So thanks for the opportunity.
Mr. Lewis.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here and on such a distinguished panel. So I don't know what I'm doing with these guys, but and I'm trying to gauge your senses here. Are you energetic, or are you having that post-lunch sugar letdown? Because if it's the letdown, I'm going to talk for a long time. And if you feel energetic and you have questions, then I'll keep it short. So look alive, will you? Okay. And when you get to questions, I've done a lot of work on the legislation and some work on with the executive order and a good bit on negotiation. So don't feel that you have to be bound if you have a topic you want to touch on. When I approach this issue, I've been doing this for a while too. Larry's taught me. I first used the internet in 1984 and thought it was, ooh, that's good, feedback. See, you shouldn't make fun of the internet. I was just about to, so I'll skip it. One of the things, having worked on some of these issues for a while, I've come to the conclusion that we've reached the point in our discussion where we have some real problems, at least in the public discussion, and there's a couple things we need to do to fix them. And one is to break the problem apart. One size no longer fits all in terms of solutions, and one size no longer fits all in terms of analysis. If you're going to analyze this as a military problem, it's different from a law enforcement problem, it's different from a trade problem, and it's different from an intelligence problem, really. There's areas of overlap, of course, but we need to start breaking this thing apart. We also we need to be more precise, right? We need to actually use data. I usually weep with joy if I hear somebody use data at a meeting I'm at. It doesn't happen very often. But one of the things we could be particularly precise about that would help shape the discussion we're having today is we could be precise about effect, right? And so I still cringe, don't take this the wrong way, I still cringe when I hear people say Pearl Harbor or Hiroshima or catastrophic or all this. It's like, that would be a really good trick. Tell me how you're going to do it. But if we could be precise about effect, it will help us think about command and control. And I think a lot of our discussion, some for perfectly good reasons of classification, has not been precise. We're in the process, looking at it as an outsider, we're in the process of normalizing or routinizing the use of cyber attack or cyber techniques to gain military advantage. And so the process that we see underway, compared to where we were 4 or 5 years ago, immense progress here in the United States to getting close to the point where this will be something we understand how to use in a way that will give us benefit over our opponent, right? It's difficult because cyber has both strategic and tactical uses, and it's easy to conflate them. But if you start breaking them apart, you can see there's one set of command and control you might need for strategic decisions. There's another set you might want for tactical decisions, something that maybe we'll talk about later on. For me, some of the big issues are who authorizes use, right? And I noticed that the secretary in his speech said that the president will authorize the use of, this is reading a bit into it, authorize the use of offensive capabilities for preemptive or defensive purposes, right? And I think that's really appropriate. Some of the actions we're thinking about will occur inside the jurisdiction of the United States. So a NORAD action, for example, it's inside our jurisdiction. There's very little political or diplomatic or legal issues with that, right, compared to other things. Other actions, and some of the actions I think the Secretary was mentioning, would occur outside of our jurisdiction. They will occur in the jurisdiction of other nations. So sometimes when you say, who is it that gets to authorize a cyber attack, or who is it that gets to authorize an action, you're really asking, who is it that gets to start a war with China, right? I don't know about you. I'm okay with, sort of maybe just the president doing that. But that's one of the things I think we're making progress on. There's another issue under what authorities. I'm not going to talk about that. It's so complicated. We can just say Title 10 and Title 50 and get them out of the way. Maybe other people want to mention it. I'm more comfortable with Title 50. I think it's a lot more fun. But you guys are probably more comfortable with Title 10. This is an issue that there are lots of lawyers, though, who are paid to think through this. I think they've done so successfully in a number of cases. Finally, we have this question of who has the lead. And I think this is always a crucial question for the military. There has not been public discussion of how the various combatant commanders will sort out when one is is it a regional lead, is it a global lead, is it a SOCOM model, is it a STRATCOM model, is it a TRANSCOM model? What is it that we're doing here? And that would be, so I said TRANSCOM to annoy them. One of the things we'll need to work out is when is it the regional combatant commander, one of the things, it may have been worked out, one of the things would be useful to know is when does it chop to the regional combatant commander, when does it retain, cyber command as the authority? Okay. I will say that I'm very skeptical of the Cold War model, and started out thinking the Cold War was swell, probably wrote that at some point, now regret it. So when I hear people say things like deterrence or it's like nuclear weapons, it's not like a nuclear weapon. Trust me, it is not. Some people in the room know what a nuclear weapon is like. And I'm not sure deterrence makes any sense at all. In fact, I was going to propose that we had a $5 ban on using it, but since I've already said it 3 times, I'm going to skip that. So we need to take a step back and say some of the old models we have for dealing with global military engagement and with strategic forces may not work for cyber, right? And so we do need to do some new thinking there. I'm pretty sure deterrence is a dud. We can have that discussion if you want. I'm also a little skeptical of having to respond at net speed. It's true in some instances, it's not true in others, right? So net speed is kind of a way to drive the debate in a certain direction, and I'm not sure we want to go there. My big fear, both in the military side and on the diplomatic side, is that cyber will become like space, right? Which is to say that we keep moving the command around, we aren't quite sure what it means, we'll write papers about space power or something, and in the negotiations internationally, it'll become like the Committee on Peaceful Uses for Outer Space, which has now been negotiating at rocket speed for 20 years and has achieved nothing. So another thing, avoid nuclear, avoid space, and you're probably in good shape, right? Doctrine and organization come from experience, and experience only comes from 2 places. It comes from operations. There is operational experience. It's not well known, but we have a history of operational experience that I think has helped to shape some of the decisions that have been made. And it comes from exercises, so it's appropriate here at the Naval Academy to point out that the fleet exercises and the fleet problems in the 1930s led the U.S. to experiment with how you use carrier aircraft, right? And that proved to be a vital set of experience in thinking how you organize fleets, how you have doctrine, how you use the new tool for military purposes. And we probably need to make more progress on that. I'm afraid we're probably going to get the operational experience whether we like it or not. I think that's the path we're on. Or exercises we have a little more control over. One thing to bear in mind is other countries have different doctrine, right? And people sometimes talk about surprise, right, and how the U.S. will be surprised. As far as I can tell, the most likely way we're going to be surprised is we may be initially expecting our opponents to walk down the avenues that we have thoughtfully laid out. And they do not have the same organizational concept, they do not have the same doctrine, they think about it in a very different way. So some of the lines we have between ASW and EW, anti-satellite and EW and cyber, I don't think the Chinese have those lines, right? They think about it in a different way. I know the Russians think about it in a different way. So one thing we need to do as we develop our own command and control is be cognizant of the fact that this is a new weapon. When we meet people and use it, they're going to use it differently, and that's going to initially give them an advantage if we are not careful, right? I talk to these people a lot. I don't like them and they don't like me, but at least we talk to each other. And a good way to think about this is we're in a competition now globally, a competition to find the best doctrine, a competition to find the best organization, right? And lots of nations are experimenting. There's probably 12 countries in the world that are trying to come up with offensive doctrine, right? And so I think we're actually one of the best, if not the best, but it's not something that you can rest on your laurels on for very long, right? I have a final note here, and I can't read it, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jim.
No, that's okay. No, because my father was a doctor, and apparently I inherited his writing skills. Oh, role of the military. Just a final thing. One of the things that was interesting in this speech is there's been a long internal debate about what the role of the military should be in defending the nation. That sounds crazy when you say it on the face of it, right? Should the military defend the nation? I don't know. Well, let me think about it, right? And so we thought about it for about 3 years, 4 years, and I think what you saw laid out on Tuesday night? Thursday night last week was a good approach to how to use military capabilities, offensive capabilities to better defend the nation. And the counterpart to that, of course, is defense is good, but figuring out how to use them to get offensive advantage, military advantage will also be useful. And I think we've made some good progress.
Okay, thanks. Admiral Train.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to Admiral Daly for including me, the Naval Academy, Naval Institute, and of course the William E. Wood Foundation. Thank you very much. As an intelligence professional, and I have been since commissioning, what I would like to address, and what takes most of my time in relation to the cyber operational realm for Department of Defense, is how intelligence informs decisions about preventing, disrupting, mitigating the threat, so assessing the threat and what that threat is in the cyber domain, how to inform warning, and how do we warn with the new threats that exist out there with cyber capabilities of some of our adversaries, and then how to inform policies, and particularly policies as it relates to the relationship across the interagency between the intelligence community and the policy community. So I can talk from that perspective in my role as the Director for Intelligence on the Joint Staff. Future state conflicts will certainly involve not only conventional warfare, but asymmetric means to include cyber. And offensive cyber is clearly going to be part of our toolkit and play a large role in any future conflict across the spectrum. Our traditional way of war demands information superiority, decision superiority. We have always assumed that in our way of warfighting. So this is a new concept that we have to address effectively in any C2 constructs because we absolutely require it to employ precision-guided munitions to identify targets that are appropriate for military, to maintain effective command and control, and also to mitigate any threat to that information dominance and decision superiority by any adversary that threatens the electromagnetic spectrum, in which we have enjoyed pretty much supremacy for many years. Information does deliver that expanded maneuver space. It delivers expanded decision space, strategic options, asymmetric capabilities to assure control of the battle space. And so that requires, in any C2 construct, speed and agility to move across that continuum that Admiral Weber mentioned from defensive to offensive operations in the battle space. And additionally, cyber operations require that innovation and speed and agility to rapidly integrate kinetic and non-kinetic fires across that spectrum. So the assurance of dominance in that electromagnetic spectrum and cyber capabilities, both our own and the adversaries, clearly need to inform any effective command and control policies and constructs. And as we work through doctrine and targeting, those command and control relationships, how we operate in an interagency environment with Department of Homeland Security, with the law enforcement, with Department of Defense, clearly are going to come into play. And as General Cartwright emphasized so articulately this morning, it's got to be legal. It has to be within the realm of Department of Defense mission, and it's about warfighting. So in my job as the Director for Intelligence, day in and day out, what takes most of my time is informing the leadership on the threat and assessing the threat. And so the threat in the cyber domain has become much more prominent, and our policy and command and control structures absolutely have to pace that threat, and they have to pace it to assure effectiveness. The threats don't logically drive you to any specific command and control construct, but they certainly do inform it. And I think that they can help us identify the key performance parameters of any command and control construct in terms of who supports, who is supported. We heard Secretary of Defense and the Chairman just last week address the risk of a cyber Pearl Harbor. If you go back and read the Graham-Rudman Commission report in 2001, that also talked about a cyber Pearl Harbor threat. To your point, it's how do you describe it? Really, what is that effect? But chaos at the beginning, at the forefront of warfighting, and do you really know you're at war or not? Is at the leading edge? That's what matters, and that's how I'll evolve into the warning discussion here. We all see in the press every day probing attacks against critical infrastructures, whether it's the finance sector, the energy sector, both here in the U.S. and abroad. And really the two greatest strategic threats that we look at from an intelligence perspective is the difficulty in providing that timely warning. How do we know it's not just cyber espionage or it's the leading edge of a complex attack by an adversary? How do we know to distinguish between those, and how do we know legally and command and control-wise whether it's appropriate for a Department of Defense warfighting response? And then secondly, the vulnerabilities to the information technology supply chain, and that was addressed earlier today and on the earlier panel as well, and how in both those cases it requires U.S. government engagement with the private sector to establish those relationships, those partnerships, those command and control authorities, accountabilities, and who's got the lead. Cyber espionage, that costs us a lot of money. It's not just trade secrets. It's technology advantage that we are losing into the future. We are sinking, many U.S. dollars into acquisition programs that aren't going to be delivered till, years out. And if those trade secrets are extracted by potential adversaries or even industry that will sell it to potential adversaries, then we do lose that technology advantage. And so cyberspace is a dominant domain here, whether you like it or not, for warfighting, for conduct of business. And it's most targeted in that business development realm, and that's where all the innovation and technology occurs. So we really have to be mindful of that as we back up that warning piece and how that can advantage an adversary. Key adversary targets, clearly, information communications technology, military technologies, business information regarding access and decisions and policies towards exploitation of natural resources, particularly the energy sector. And then dual-use technologies. You heard mentioned earlier this morning about pharmaceutical. Any business technology that has a dual use, that has rapid growth potential is an ideal target. These are all areas that require partnering across the private sector. In terms of warning, I already mentioned what's espionage, what's not, what's the leading edge of an attack. But the future of cyber warning requires an integrated look across DoD and the private sector. Technology, threat to the information, and threat to our acquisition programs is what I care about in terms of warning. Warning can be tactical in terms of an impending attack. That often takes perhaps some kind of tools and instruments to detect, and some of that has to be automated. But strategic warning, what is the impact of information in an adversary's hands over technology that we are either in the process of fielding or have right now in terms of countermeasures, is critical to warfighting capabilities. So the interdependencies and the independencies we have to absolutely appreciate. Policy requires new authorities and sharing policies across both the private and the government sectors. And I think in terms of the relationship between the intelligence community and the policy community, we have to stay tightly partnered so that the intelligence community can understand what those thresholds are for activities in the cyber domain that require a U.S. government response, perhaps in defense of the nation, and what thresholds there are in order for us to drive prioritized collection, analysis, warning, and advising what those response options might be and what the second and third order of effects are. So I think in terms of a cyber warning construct, there are new things we have to think about beyond what our traditional Department of Defense strategic warning constructs have been, and you have to think about it strategically, operationally, and tactically, and then in using intelligence to advise those decisions that are being made on how to respond or if to respond and who best to respond needs to be take into account what second and third order of effects are. Are we opening a Pandora's box, or are we really shutting down a threat? So that's what I'd like to bring to your attention this afternoon.
Well, good afternoon. Obviously, one of these things is not like the other, and I'm from the Army. And as we drove on campus, I said, I'm just glad it's October, not November. Thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk to you today. I obviously am not General Davis, and he would really, really rather be here. He's down in the Pentagon trying to justify money in front of a bunch of folks that outrank him. So he would really rather be here. Many of the comments I was going to start with have already been covered, so I'm going to focus in on two things. And I'm going to start with what you ended with, which is effects. I had an opportunity in my job a couple jobs ago to sit down with some of the leadership from Estonia. And as y'all think back to about 2007, 2008 timeframe, they were going to take down a statue of a Russian on a horse. And it caused a little stir, and so there were some hacktivists that decided to pile on. This is way too loud, so what am I doing wrong here? Don't touch the mic. The net result of that was a little denial of service attack against the government web pages. And the leadership rep that came to our country to talk to us about that said the web page was not really taken down. You could still get to it. But the effect that it had on the people of Estonia was they lost the trust and confidence in their government to do anything about this attack on their government web pages. So sometimes the technical effect is not nearly as important as the real effect across your government. I think Secretary Panetta was pretty clear. Cyber is a team sport, and DoD has a role to play in that. And I think he was very precise, so I don't need to cover that. Let me just tell you what Cybercom's focused on. We got 5 priorities and only 5. Now, if y'all know General Alexander, he probably could have had 20 and focused on all, but I'm an Aggie, so 5's good. Our number 1 priority, and Diane and Admiral Weber touched on it briefly, is trained and ready forces, trained and ready cyber teams, presented to the command, presented to the combatant commanders in a way that they can use them. Trained to a standard, certified, exercised, and ready to do business for our country. Now, it may surprise some of y'all, but a cyber warrior doesn't necessarily look like the midshipman running around outside. You know, they can run 15 miles and not sweat and swim forever, et cetera. Some of our cyber warriors don't necessarily fit the stereotype of a soldier or a sailor. But they know their business and they're very, very good at it. And so we have to think a little differently of how we recruit, retain, train, and certify folks. And that's all very, very, very important to the future. Our number 2 priority is the defensible architecture. And being a communicator, you know, I could probably talk for hours and hours and hours about how we got to where we are and what we really need. I'm just going to leave it at this. There's key terrain inside of our DoD infrastructure, and we need to know where it is and how to protect it differently. And then we need to know how to defend what we need to defend. And we can take those in comments and questions if you want. Command and control. Everybody out there in the Department of Defense, whether you're a service, an agency, or combatant command, has a piece in this overarching effort. And what we need is a clean enough command and control that you have a unity of effort. And there can only be one person in the top of the governance making those decisions that Mr. Lewis talked about. The authority to act in defense of the nation, I think Mr. Lewis talked about some of the pieces and parts to that. And the last one I'm going to leave you with is global situational awareness. It's not a holy grail. We really do need to understand what our networks look like, what's going on in the networks, what the red is doing to our networks, our adversaries are doing to our networks, and be able to see, block, and maneuver to affect the operations for our networks. Mr. Lewis mentioned normalize. You can tell we worked together before. Because my other point I was going to make is cyberspace is similar to other domains in a lot of ways, and I'll just highlight a couple. We have a need for basic military planning in cyberspace. We need a huge amount of intelligence to conduct the operations. And at the end, we need to assess how we did and make changes for the next round. With that, I'll pass it back to our moderator for questions.
Okay, thanks very much to the panel for the for the excellent presentations. And with that, we're ready to take your questions. So, yes, sir, right there.
We have about 80 to 90% of our communications provided by commercial providers, just mentioned a few minutes ago. We certainly have a huge vulnerability here, and although we are giving appropriate attention to cyber threats, at some point we cross the line from cyber to direct jamming effects, and we are going to be without our communications. Mr. Lewis has addressed this, I think. I'd like to have a panel say something about when we leave the area of cyber and when we enter the area of jamming. What's going to happen with this huge vulnerability that we have with all of this in the commercial basket? Only a very small portion, the ADHS portion, is protected. How do we handle this?
Who wants to try that?
I'll speak to the operational piece, and then maybe Major General Napper might talk about some of the partnerships and what she sees from Cybercom. Operationally, you're absolutely right. There's just a small chunk of the bandwidth that at the current moment is protected from jamming, and we're well aware of that. So we have partnered with a variety of folks in industry as well as ONR to come up with some alternatives. How can you either prevent the jamming, or how can you reconstruct and get buyback, we call it buyback bandwidth, in that type of scenario. And that's framing the problem one way, and saying, hey, we need X amount of bandwidth to conduct operations. You can frame it another way and say you won't have bandwidth, and you will have intermittent communication. So how do you do C2, and how do you do the power projection? And then in that case, you might look, for example, at the submarines, who have infrequent communication, small pipes. How does their C2 happen? It's lots of processing ashore, lots of selective pushes forward, so that they have the essay and the directives they need to accomplish a mission. So that's the full spectrum approach that OpNav and 10th Fleet are looking at to kind of cover those gaps.
Anyone else on that?
No, I think you said it very well. I would push back a little bit and say that at what point are we going to recognize that electronic warfare is a part of and influences cyberspace, as opposed to saying they're totally separate and distinct items? Sure. If you look at what we define cyberspace as, the connection of internetworks and pieces and processes and all that, you've read it, I'm sure, sir. There are many different ways to affect whether or not those things are functioning correctly. One is with digits or malicious software through the network. One is with electronic warfare. One is with cutting off the power. One is taking out people. There's lots of different things in there. They all affect it. So you just have to, at what point do they cross? And I think there needs to be a long dialogue and discussion about electronic warfare and the role it plays, and where's the connection point with cyberspace.
Yes. Oh, right there. Yes.
I guess my question is almost like a follow-on. As a tactical pilot, we have the rules of engagement that are very tactical. And the person who walked through the process of having a cruise missile authority being generated by the president, or like that walked down from a 14-day overflight privilege to a 7-day to a 4 hours, and not even having the president. The issue there is those targets weren't moving anywhere. They didn't have the chance to demobilize and reposition themselves. So how realistic is it to work through a whole Title 10, Title 50 sequence and have the president as the overarching authority when I can take out a telecom site that I know is executing an IED event because the phone message went through that tower. So the basic question is, how can we look at rules of engagement that go focused enough to allow our point of sale warfighter the ability to act without having to go all the way back up to the chain to help them to act?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll start and then I'll let Mr. Lewis clean up whatever I say. So it seems to me that you start with the military does its normal contingency planning and begins to look at potential adversaries holistically. And then within looking at those potential adversaries, then what are their vulnerabilities and how would you change the battlefield calculus of their decision making? That would require some prep of the environment, okay? And no matter whether you're doing it in the cyberspace or any other domain, you have to prepare the environment to know what your target sets are. So that isn't any different in our business. Then when you get into the business of actually when you have authorities, none of those are ever executed, none of those plans, unless there's an execute order. So whether that's an execute order for each individual target set or whether that's an execute order for a set of target sets, I believe will be fleshed out as we go through the whole process of doing that pre-planned targeting. I'll let you clean up anything I didn't get quite
Jim,
straight.
did you have anything on that?
You just might want to think of a matrix, and I think it pretty much reflects what we've been talking about. Conflict versus non-conflict, right? Different decision chains for that. And what I'll call strategic versus tactical, right? And so if you think tactical conflict, you want to push it down as low as possible. Strategic non-conflict, you probably want to push it as high as possible. And so if you start splitting it into that matrix, it's a little easier to figure out. It won't be one size fits all. I think you're right there.
The gentleman up at the microphone.
Yeah, Mr. Lewis, you talked about exercises, and General Napper, you discussed, having people that are trained in exercise. Having worked in multiple exercises, I noticed the rules of engagement are I cannot degrade the network during the exercise. I cannot do anything that would embarrass anybody. I cannot run actual spearfishing attacks during the exercise. It comes to the, can't operational versus security fight. How would you proper exercise and get through that wall of making cyber more realistic? Like, hey, your phone doesn't work.
Yeah, so
How do you operate?
I don't mind starting it and letting someone else pile on. So exercises are one of my favorite subjects. Commanders determine the purpose and focus of an exercise and what objectives they're trying to get out of it. So if you're sitting in an exercise in a particular theater and one of the commander's objectives is to learn to fight through a cyber attack, then normally, usually, he'll let the red team go a little bit further in degrading the communications to see how the staff would operate through that. If that's not one of the objectives of the exercise, and it's to do some sort of proof of concept of some of our operation, then he's probably not going to let us degrade the networks very far before he says, thanks, got the point, move on. So that's my take on it.
I will just say I sat in on Terminal Fury before I arrived at Fleet Cybercom. I flew out to Hawaii and sat in on Terminal Fury 12, and we did in fact take some things down on purpose. I mean, then there were those instances where we took things down in response to a perceived problem, but I think increasingly we are starting to shut things off and see how it goes and do the workarounds that we need to. So and it's always then plugged back in to inform our concept of ops, and then it wanders off up to OpNav in terms of gaps that we need to fill. So I have lived in that environment where they will not allow you to shut stuff down, but I think increasingly because of the risk, they're allowing us to do that. That's what I have experienced the last 3 years.
So going back to the policy command and control discussion, I think it is helpful that the department has said you will start including cyber activities in your Tier 1 exercises, because then you have to put that somewhere in your objective list if you're a COCOM and you're running one of the top level exercises. And so that is helping us shape then how do you fight through those kinds of dirty environments, as we used to say in the Cold War.
Okay. Yes.
Just to follow on, very similar follow on, this is a question that relates to command and control of information-related capabilities. So when we talk information-related capabilities, cyber is just one. We've got some of the other capabilities that General Cartwright mentioned this morning that you all touched on, electronic warfare, question. My question for you, and I'll take it, focus it in down the aperture on the Joint Task Force level. The commander and the staff, let's say the J5, the J35, the key elements of the staff, being able to, let's say, from the commander's viewpoint, give a clear view of guidance on what he expects or she expects with regard to the integration of these information-related capabilities in the campaign, and then the staff, particularly the J39 and the people that control these particular capabilities for the planning execution, being able to develop a line of operations or a plan to support it, which I think is where you're going, General, in terms of that would be the objective. I think we have a way to go to close the gap today in terms of the comfort of the commander to be able to understand and direct what he wants guidance-wise for a campaign and the staff to execute. So my question would be to you, are there other things, what are we doing to close that gap? Better confidence of the commander to lay out the guidance and then skills and abilities of the staff to execute.
You want to take it first or want me to? Okay, so since you pointed at me for as a follow-on, I'll take it first again.
Good.
So from my perspective, it takes two things. One is the skilled, educated, trained planners that actually understand the capabilities top to bottom, and therefore when they're talking about them can articulate them in warfighting terms back to the commander. And number two is a clear articulation, not so much of what you're bringing to the table as a capability, but the results you get if you use the capability, so that you can then figure out how to integrate them correctly to get the result the boss is looking for.
I would speak to my Northcom experience a little bit as the J6, and you heard me reference the Cyber Fusion Cell. And Navy in Washington has combined the N2 and the N6, but out in the fleet, the N2 and the N6 are still stovepiped. But at Northcom, the J6 drove the creation of a Cyber Fusion Cell, mostly because I was tired of joining the movie in progress. And that was the 2, the 39, and the 6. And every now and then, based on what was going on with future ops, you'd drag in the 5. But that group, we required from the get-go to sit down and talk about what the operation was and where we were going with it. And it kept all the key players at the table simultaneously, and the speed to which we could get to a resolution of a problem or where we were going was amazing to me. And we were just Northcom. We were brand new at it. But the 2, 3, and the 6, I think we have some organizational, just some basic stovepipes we need to break down a little bit. And you're seeing a little bit on the Navy and other services now, but that's the start, I think.
To touch on a couple points, I think what you're seeing is, and it sort of falls under what they said, but not really. You're seeing EW and cyber blend in some way, and we haven't figured out how it's going to blend. That parallels developments in the commercial market, and that's one of the things we're going to have to play with, right? And I've been thinking about this for a while, and I just don't have a good sense of, how you would make this go forward. I just know it's something that as we get more experience, we'll have to change. On the exercise part, I'm going to tell you an out-of-school fairy tale, which is I got to go to a small dinner with a Navy admiral who had 3 or 4 stars, I can't remember, and he said he didn't like cyber exercises because very often they used fairy dust, right? That was his term. That people, when they had a problem, they would sprinkle fairy dust, cyber, over the thing. And his goal was to get, I think, more realistic exercises. So to the extent they're realistic, and we all know this, that you have exercises where you press the reset button because you don't like the outcome. You have exercises where you go through the real thing and sometimes you lose. So that would be an interesting test. How many extra times does the blue team not win in an exercise? That's kind of what we're looking at. I think all these things will require experience, though. That's where at a very early, someone brought up the airplane metaphor. What is this? Is this the joke we used to make, and some of the other things I did is that the internet started out as a Model T. We've made good progress because now we're at the Model A, right? And that's kind of where we are in thinking through some of these harder problems that you guys have identified.
We need to have, US and I have an essay competition. The old bins, IW, IO, space, EW, they don't work for us. And the doctrine associated with it is constraining. It constrains our thinking. So have a competition and get all the great brains together and sort that out for us.
Captain?
Yes, Captain Mark Hagerod. I'm here on the faculty teaching a course related to cyber, but also work on the side with an OSD project on Next Tech. And we talked quite a bit about robotic revolution coming. So 2 revolutions, cyber, robotics. And interesting, a senior executive of a robotic company, we asked him about how much farther can he go until he's really sure of the cybersecurity of the systems. And he said, well, we're counting on the cyber people figuring that all out. And so I'm just kind of opening a question here. Is there a limitation of how far unmanned systems can go before this problem, if it ever can be solved, needs to be brought to a high level of confidence and reliability before we turn over weapons to these systems? And just open a question over my one.
Great question.
Well, certainly the other folks are thinking hard about how to do this, and we all know this, that starting really back 20 years ago with the first Persian Gulf War, everyone sort of took a deep breath and said, hey, the Americans are on to a different way, and we got to figure out, 1, how we get some of that ourselves, but 2, how do we find the asymmetric vulnerabilities that we can beat? And figuring out how to interfere with unmanned vehicles is probably right up there with interfering with GPS on the list of some of our friends. And I don't know how far they've gotten, right? I think, you know, I like the Iranians when they claim to, I think they said they used thought waves to shoot down that drone or something. But, and then they were going to rebuild it with Legos, so it was a good, just all around good Iranian thing. But it's a fair point, right? And the line that we were all laughing at, I think we were all laughing at, is when you said, well, I don't worry about that, the cyber guys will fix it. It's like, yeah, right. That's one of the things we have to work on in the larger industry is people tend to say, well, it's not my problem, they'll fix it, right? And it turns out, as we all know, when you do that, nobody's actually fixing the problem. So that'd be something I'd check.
Okay. Up at the top there.
Good afternoon. My quick question, I'd like to circle back to the trained and ready forces, if I may. It's no secret that we exert a lot of resources, a lot of time and energy, and like Rear Admiral Weber commented on, the assessments that are out there, and just how poorly we're doing. And I think it was Major General, you talked about the accountability piece with General Alexander. Where are we at with really actually just dropping the hammer to be blunt, for the failure to non-compliance within the units at least? Because we have a cultural issue. Mr. Mitnick gave a great brief on the social side of things and the human element, which is really big within the intelligence community. And really, regardless of whether you're on a float unit, you're on a shore base, at the end of the day, there's always somebody in charge. And in order to really turn the corner, the accountability is going to have to be looked at there.
So I'll start it, and then I'm sure there's a lot of conversations on this subject. So I've got a lot of scar tissue based upon my experience in the last 5 years. 4 years as a commander in charge of networks, and then before that, JTF-GNO, which, as y'all probably know, was the operate and defend the gig before we merged into cyberspace, cyber command. So I have a lot of scar tissue about what does it really take to be compliant. And it would be really nice if we were like the Navy and had an enterprise network, because you do. NMCI, for all its good, bad, ugly, whatever, is an enterprise. And so if you say push a patch, they can, okay? And they already know what's on the network, what applications, because you had a CIO that put the foot down about 5, 6 years ago and said you're not getting on the network unless. Unfortunately, the rest of us don't have that yet. And so we are spending the time to get to one network so that it has consistent standards, policies, practices, ports and protocols, name it, the whole gamut, and get to a defensible architecture, because it's not today. So instead, what you have is not only not one network, but not one person responsible for it. So we're military. You can't hold people accountable for things unless they are responsible and have the ability to be accountable. So that's one thing. Number two is the culture change. And I've been told it takes a lot to change the direction of a big ship. I wouldn't know, but that's what I've been told. And I will tell you that commanders and units think that the network is there for whatever they need it for or want it for, in the United States Army and in many other organizations. And so changing that thought process that it's not, it is, but it isn't. What you do and don't do has an effect on everybody else. And oh, by the way, you're interconnected, and what you just said that you had to have on your network left a vulnerability that was big and gaping and caused a non-compliance is a whole culture change. I sat through a session 4.5 years ago. Y'all may be familiar with the term the tank, when we would try to propose that the unclassified network be used for mission only. In other words, no more MWR, no checking your personal Yahoo email, doing your banking, fill in the blank. And I was surprised at the result. We did not win that debate, and it is still based upon service rules as opposed to a common set of rules. So I would love to go out and, prosecute anybody who violated what they signed on user agreements or didn't run their network correctly, but that is not necessarily a viable course of action at this time.
I touched on accountability very briefly earlier. Two things. First, somebody's always in charge, but I'll tell you, Admiral Rogers has, for lack of a better way to phrase it, declined opportunities to fire those in charge because he recognizes full well you got to have the SMEs, you got to have the subject matter experts who are there because and taking charge of the day-to-day activities that ensure your compliance. And what we've seen is hard-charging COs, XOs that want to get it done, they lay down the law. When they turn to their expert, it turns out that he or she is not an expert. We also have an ongoing dialogue with Cybercom about compliance. And I think there is some degree of compliance that we've got to do, but the reality is we can't fix everything. We don't have the time and resources to fix everything. So you go to war with some vulnerabilities. You need to understand what they are and what the risk to any given set of missions and activities you may be undertaking. And now that's where the intelligence community can help out by helping us understand, I've got this problem, I've got this vulnerability, I'm about to do X, Y, Z in terms of a mission. What is the likelihood of this vulnerability being exploited based on the intent and capability of the adversary? We're not quite there yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I think that's one of the pieces that we're looking towards in terms of an effective warning construct vis-a-vis cyber, is you have to have that sort of that database, that knowledge base of what penetrations have occurred on what types of networks so that you can rapidly assess. And some of that assessment has to be in automated fashion by a man in the loop. So some of it can be done automated, some of it has to be done man in the loop. But you have to have the knowledge base, the database of the penetrations and the activities in order to assess against them and knowing who your potential adversaries are in your operating environment.
So to get at the training that Admiral Weber is talking about, Cyber Command J7 has already developed what are the 42 different skills required in the cyber workforce, and they include things you recognize right away, system administrators, et cetera. It also includes on-network operators, intel analysts, et cetera. But there's 42. He's lined out all the training required and certification for each one of them. It's a matter now of institutionalizing that and then getting the services to train, organize, train, and train for that. Many of those training are already available in the services. That's where we got a lot of this knowledge from. We pulled in the services to look at what training is required. We just don't have the same standard all the way across yet, and that's what's really, really critical.
We have time for one more question. Yes, at the top.
Hi, my name is Spencer Johnson. I'm an old retired naval officer, and I used to wrestle with the Unified Command Plan. And my question is, unless things have changed, when NORTHCOM was stood up, NORTHCOM received the mission of military support to civil authorities. Now, does that give NORTHCOM a heavier burden in integrating cyber defense for the industrial sector of our economy?
Thank you. You know, I spent my first year at Northcom as the J6 of NORAD and Northcom without Cybercom. And so we did, in fact, go on the road and work with DHS and industry players because of the interdependencies of our systems on those partners. I think after the stand-up of Cybercom, and I don't know, I've lost track of what version we are with the UCP, and it probably will change as Cybercom matures. But certainly when Admiral Winnefeld took over, and he took over just about the same time Alexander, they went through confirmation hearings together. They agreed that Northcom, and I was the first to admit, we didn't really have the assets. And in fact, I had a conversation with then Lieutenant General Alexander saying, well, Northcom is Northcom, and if anything happened in this nation as the co-com for, the home front, we would be responding to the president on what's going on. We would be responsible for telling that story. We would be leveraging, I thought, what NSA and then Cybercom, JFCC, the elements that they pulled together to create Cybercom had to offer. But we thought that we would be front and center. The DISCA mission still remains with Northcom. But again, because the expertise is largely at Cybercom, I think there's a partnership that tends to, they work together with Cybercom, but I don't think Northcom would actually stand up and take the helm on cyber issues.
Okay, well, with that, I'm sorry, did you want to?
It's a supporting supported. So if they're doing the consequence management and support to the homeland in some other area, and there's a cyber aspect, we would be the supporting command for that. And if it's strictly a cyber event, then they would be the supporting. So supporting supported, just like we do in the UCP on anything else.
Okay, well, let me thank General Napper and Admiral Train, Mr. Lewis, and Admiral Weber for their contributions this afternoon. It's been a great experience. Thank you all for your interest and your enthusiasm. I think Jim's comment earlier may have gotten you stirred up, but you were a great set of participants, so thank you all for some excellent questions.